Last Sunday when Brad led singing, he included a song, the name of which I cannot remember, and I'm not sure that I knew it all that well when he led it, but it included something about a banquet. And after worship was over and we were leaving, Kathy mentioned that to me because it kind of got her attention, the idea of a banquet. And I guess the reality is, we don't talk much about the banquet concept of the kingdom, although the Lord did. And I have preached on it and taught on it a number of times over the years. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to do so again. We're going to be in Luke 14 tonight. Luke 14 is interesting because it parallels somewhat some thoughts that we had this morning out of Luke 13 and also in Luke 7 and related passages. In our text tonight, Jesus will emphasize a banquet because he's attending one in Luke 14. He was invited to a dinner. And it's fascinating to me that in this passage tonight, as well as one that we looked at this morning, Jesus was watching people. And based on what he saw, he taught. Tonight, we're going to look at a parable that Jesus presented to his hearers, but that parable was based on the people that were in front of him. And it's very intriguing when you think about it. This lesson tonight will be designed to help you in one particular way, and that is to have a greater appreciation for the church. I sometimes wonder how much we appreciate the church, and I know Sunday night crowds appreciate the church more than anybody. But I fear that sometimes we have a concept of the church that it's just an offshoot of a denomination. It's a traditional thing. It's the root of the Stone Campbell movement, and that's all it is. Consequently, it doesn't mean much to us. It's not all that attractive to us. Oh, we're interested maybe to a degree. But tonight, Jesus is going to be talking about a banquet. But it's not just a banquet. This is the kingdom of heaven that he's talking about. And if I can take what he says tonight about the kingdom of heaven and expand on that to understand this is what the church is. Because in what we'll look at tonight, people are invited. And some refuse the invitation. They have their excuses all lined up. Well, that's what the church is. The church invites people. The Great Commission, that's what it's all about. So I hope that what we see tonight in terms of the banquet of the kingdom will instill within us a greater love for the church as we know it and appreciation for the banquet of the kingdom. I suppose everybody likes banquets. Whatever the banquet is, it may be a sports banquet. It may be a retirement banquet. I remember years ago when I was donating platelets at the American Red Cross, and I did that for 20 years. They would have banquets for donors. And these were pretty nice affairs. And I would go and loved it. Well, they cut that out a long time ago, budget cuts and that sort of thing. But they were enjoyable. So banquets, everybody loves a banquet, I guess. And it's, if you want to step down a notch or two, it's hard for me to understand the thinking of somebody that would prefer to miss a potluck on Sunday mornings. I don't want to miss a potluck, and I don't want to miss a banquet. And we used to have banquets here at Mableville. We would have teachers' appreciation banquets. You remember those? Yeah. So we understand about banquets, and as far as I know, everybody loves one, you know. Who doesn't love to eat? But anyway, the idea of a banquet is what this passage is all about. Now, with respect to Jesus' presentation of it, in terms of the kingdom of heaven being a banquet, he will elaborate on that concept, and he'll draw it out through the 14th chapter. And some of the thoughts that I want you to glean from this are these. In terms of the kingdom of heaven being a banquet, we appreciate it for its excellence. There's nothing better. There's no sports banquet. There's no club banquet. There's no teacher appreciation banquet, retirement banquet, or whatever that tops what we're dealing with here tonight in terms of the excellence of this banquet. Look at Luke 14 and verse 15 just a moment. And when those who sat at the table with him heard these things, what preceded all of this? He said to him, "Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." Blessed. This is an excellent thing. This is what the Jews looked forward to and anticipated with the coming of Messiah. So they pictured the coming of the kingdom as a banquet, and they wanted to be there. That denotes the excellence of it. And then there's the abundance of this banquet, beginning in verse 16, going down through verse 24. We'll touch on this a little bit tonight because invitations are extended. And these invitations involve many people. The abundance of it, this is a big thing. And for us, this transcends the centuries, so it comes down to our present day, and we're still talking about it. That's how abundant this thing is. But then thirdly, there's a fellowship involved. Fellowship at the table. And I love to think about Matthew chapter 8 and verse 11 in this connection. And I want to turn to it just to read it and think about it, because Jesus' statement here follows the healing that took place in the verses preceding it. In verse 10, in regard to the matter of authority and so forth, when Jesus heard it, he marveled, and he said to those who followed, "Assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, no, not in Israel." The faith of a non-Jew is what he highlighted. Then in verse 11, "I say unto you that many will come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Banquet is not mentioned here, but sitting down is. And that's what they did at banquets. And many would come from the east and the west, and I think that includes us. Those Gentiles who would come from different directions and sit down with the patriarchs of the Old Testament. That's what we're doing now. We're in a banquet, as it were, because of the kingdom of heaven. This sort of outlines what we're dealing with here tonight. And Jesus presents it to us in the form of a parable. Going back to Luke 14, look at verse 7. And he told a parable to those who were invited when he noted how they chose the best places. All right. So again, Jesus was a people watcher. Some of you are people watchers. And watching people, he noticed what they were doing, and he taught based on what he saw. Consequently, we have a parable that comes out of it. In fact, we have a lot of teaching that comes out of it. And from the parable that Jesus gives, which constitutes our text tonight in verses 7 through 11, Jesus will do two things here. Number one, he will deal with the lower realms of humanity and how you ought to act with people. And in verses 8 through 11, based on what he saw, he advises these people, when you are invited, or when you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you and him come and say to you, give place to this man, and then you begin with shame to take the lower place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, go up higher. Then you will have the glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. And here's the whole point of it. Verse 11, for whoever exalts himself will be abased, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So Jesus took advantage of the opportunity, and he presented a little scenario here as to what to do when you go into a social setting like this, and what not to do when you go into such a setting. And Jesus' point is very simple. It's a point about humility, and that's all it is. So the lower realms of social intercourse, here's how you deal with people, and here's how you present yourself and how you don't present yourself. And interestingly enough, this idea comes from Proverbs 25, verses 6 and 7. I'll just leave that with you. Proverbs 25, 6 and 7. I want you to read that when you have opportunity, and notice how closely it parallels what Jesus said here. All right, that's the. When I say lower, I'm not talking about like friends in low places here. I'm talking about just the ordinary things that people do. This is what the Lord focused on here. And then there's a higher realm that he will deal with in verses 16 through 24, and we'll note that tonight as we have opportunity. Now, there are two things tonight that I want us to see out of this. Number one, there's an invitation. And number two, the receptions of the invitation. Number one, the invitation. But let's set the background just a little bit, if we might. In Luke 14 and verse 1, he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath. And they watched him closely. That's interesting. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. So Jesus noticed a sick man. And answering, Jesus spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees, I guess answering what was in their minds. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day or on the Sabbath? And it's interesting that Jesus would ask that question because he has been asked that question. In Matthew 12 and verse 10, there were those who asked him that question, and they expected a straight answer from him. But now Jesus asked the same question, and he gets silence. But they kept silent in verse 4. And he took him and healed him and let him go. And then he in verses 5 or in verse 5 simply asks, well, which of you having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit would not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him regarding these things. Talk about speechless. They had no reply. So, from all of that, in verse 7, Jesus spoke a parable. Now, isn't it interesting? Just from that moment, he fashioned this little parable, and we've already read it, and he puts it out there. So here are the invitations, and the invitations if we might skip down to verses 16 and 17. I'm going to bypass just a little section here, 12 through 15. But skip down to verse 16. Notice the invitations that Jesus alludes to here, because this is a banquet setting. And somebody had observed all of this and said, blessed is he who sits down in the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of God. So the Lord elaborates on that. And here come the invitations. A certain man gave a great dinner, and he invited many. And sent his servant at supper time to say to those who were invited, come, for all things are now ready. I want you to just look at those two verses and think about the invitation, because the invitation that is mentioned here involved a great many people over a long span of time. The invitation here went out to the Jews, God's chosen. And these people were invited by, the prophets of the Old Testament, John the Baptist, followed by Jesus. So over the centuries, the invitations went out, and the Jews received a written invitation even, because that's what the Old Testament was. Galatians 3 and verse 24. The law was a tutor, it was a schoolmaster, intended to bring them to Christ. That was the invitation. It had been out there for centuries. It had gone out to many, Jesus said. Now, in verse 17, after all of that inviting of many, then comes the servant in verse 17. What's interesting about parables, one of the things that's interesting is details are not spelled out for you. You may not know what's what in a particular parable. You might have to wonder about it or guess, I don't know. But here's a servant. We're not told who this servant was in verse 17. But I'll tell you what I do know. I know that there's a suffering servant in Isaiah 53 that is spoken of. Read all of Isaiah 53. And you carry that forward, and I know that Jesus Christ fit the bill. I know that Jesus himself taught what servanthood was all about. He said he didn't come to be served. He said, I've come to serve. That's what a servant is. I know that in Philippians 2 and verse 7, that Paul spoke of Jesus having come in the form of a servant, made in the likeness of man. I know that. So when I read this and it says he sent his servant, then I have to think Jesus. Although it doesn't say who this servant was. So there are the prophets, there's John the Baptist, and there's the servant. And they all invited these great many, many people to this banquet. In the verses that follow, we have the receptions that people gave to these invitations. And there are three classes or three groups that are noted here. And this is fascinating stuff. In verse 18, here's the first group. And this first group, Jesus said, they all with one accord began to make excuses. What excuses? Well, the first said to him, the servant who had invited him to the banquet, well, I bought a piece of ground. I must go and see it. I ask you to have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen. I'm going to test them. I ask you to have me excused. Still another said, I've married a wife and therefore I cannot come. So, these excuses, when you look at them, they don't make sense. But then I have to remember, they're not intended to make sense. And I say they don't make sense simply because logic says if you buy a piece of property, logic tells me that you will have already looked at it, and you don't have to buy it and then go look at it. That just doesn't ring true. And then if you buy 5 yoke of oxen, I would suspect that you've already tested them out to see if they're any good, or you wouldn't buy them. And then if you're married and you're too busy and you can't be there, well, I can understand that too. That does make sense. These other two don't make sense. They're not supposed to make sense. The idea being that this first group, all of them across the board, rejected the invitation. They had their excuses. I must not, I cannot, I will not, was the general feeling of the group. And that was true of basically the Jewish society at large, especially the religious leaders who rejected the kingdom of God because of their love for the cares of the world, the love of riches, and the pleasures of this life. They had no interest in this invitation, you see. So that's the first group. Then we read on a little bit further. We come down to verse 21. The servant came and reported these things to the master. Then the master of the house became angry and said to the servant, or his servant, go out quickly into the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in here the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind. Well, these are the very kinds of people that we've been reading about in Matthew 21 in our Wednesday night class. These are the people in the temple that came to Jesus. That very same kind of people. And you know what? As I'm reading verse 21, all I have to do is shift my eyes over to the next column in my Bible, and I have Luke 15 right there in front of me. And Luke 15 begins this way. Then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to hear him, and the Pharisees and the scribes complained about it, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So there's a commentary on exactly what the second group is all about. That's interesting to me. And then in verse 23, here's the third group. Then the master said to the servant, go out into the highways and the hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. Well, why would you have to compel them to come in? That sounds like physical force. That's not what it was. It was compelling them by inviting them, preaching to them, appealing to them, getting to their heart. You see, you compel them to come in. And that was to the Gentile world because they didn't feel worthy and they were not considered worthy to come in, so they had to be compelled to come in. Thus the invitations to all of humanity go out, and the receptions that are received to those invitations. Now, when we think about these things ourselves, think about how people receive the gospel today or don't receive it. Sometimes people will say, well, I'm just too mean. if people knew the things I've done, and I don't see how God could forgive me of some of the things I've done. I'm too mean of a person. I've heard people say that. And then on the other hand, some will say, well, I'm too good, really. Well, they may not word it exactly that way, but they will say something to the effect that I'm a whole lot better than a great many of those people down there at that church. I know too much about them. So you got that sort of thing going on. And again, some will say, well, I know too much about certain people. I know how hypocritical they are. And then on the flip side of that, some will say, well, they pick up their Bible and they can't find one book in the Old Testament and one in the New, and they say, I don't know enough about the Bible. I'm just too ignorant, you see. Well, they won't say that, but I don't know enough about the Bible. So I know too much, and then I don't know enough. So you've got that kind of thing going on. And then people will say, well, life is hard. I'm too busy. You don't know what it's like to be me. All right. And now these days, in the wake of COVID, people will say, well, I'm not getting out. Don't look for me. All right, so all of these excuses. So you consider how people are. When you read Luke 14, you see how people are. That's what's so intriguing about this to me, is the Lord's dealing with people. He's watching people, and He's expounding based on what He sees in people, the eternal lessons that we need to learn. And He's showing us what the kingdom is and how people react to all of that. And here's how people are. And I want to know, how does the Lord put up with us? This is how we are. And I'm grateful that He does put up with us. How does He do it? Well, God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. That's that invitation, you see. How does He put up with us? Well, He doesn't want anyone to perish. And He's made it possible that all should come to repentance through the gospel, the invitation. He can put up with us. But there'll come a time when He won't put up with us any longer. Yeah, it's appointed unto man once to die, and after that, the judgment. And if we don't get our act together and respond to those invitations properly, the Lord's putting up with has come to an end. And we have our chance now to sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as it were, to sit down at the banquet of the kingdom and enjoy ourselves in what is the most wonderful thing that God has ever provided. The banquet of the kingdom. I love that thought. And boy, Jesus really elaborates on it here in Luke 14. So, something to think about. Do you appreciate the church more? I hope you do. You want to be in it? If you're not in it, and do what you we don't look at these excuses just keep us where people just refuse to obey the gospel. Sometimes we look at these and we fail to step up to the plate ourselves and serve in ways that we ought to. And we bury our talents, as it were. So we don't need to do that either. Come to the banquet tonight, please. And if you're not, or if you are there, then enjoy yourself, because there's nothing better than this banquet. Maybe you need to respond to the invitation to obey the gospel, or to come back to the Lord and enjoy yourself at the banquet of the kingdom tonight while we sing to encourage you.